Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining me again here on another episode of Stvpett Reads Live. Tonight we are going to be continuing with Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. Here's a copy of the book there. There it is. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. Basically, I just like to reiterate kind of what I said last week, which is, C.S. Lewis is a very famous author and so forth, but he is a product of his time. That means that he has some views on the place of women, as well as some views on homosexuality that we do not generally view as being acceptable any longer. I am not one who tends to believe that just because someone has wrong or objectionable views in one area, that all other things that they do, all good things they may have done, all other thoughts that they may have had, become immediately suspect or wrong, are no longer worthy of discussion. I do not hold to that view, so we will continue. Nothing, as far as I remember, nothing in the book that those particular views are not like the focus of any chapter or anything like that. It's merely almost an offhand comments, small comments along the way. And when they do come up, we will discuss them in the discussion afterwards. So I'm not going to censor anything. I'll read it as written. And if, he says something objectionable, then we will talk about it afterwards. But I just don't believe that the objectionable things that he says, cancels out the thought-provoking nature of his work other than that. So, we are returning this week to our previous format where we start each week with a poem. We are still reading poems from this book, Reflections, Poems of Communion, by the relatively new poet Bethany Roberts. I will post in the chat right now a link to her Instagram page. I did speak to her before I started reading her works on our channel here to get her permission, and she told me that was fine, that I could use it, and that if anyone did want a copy of her book, they could contact her through her Instagram, which, as I said, I have just posted in the chat now. So if you enjoy these poems from Bethany Roberts, I encourage you to contact her through Instagram. So this particular poem is called First Snow. Don't fear. The promises for your life haven't been forgotten. There is much more that has yet to be discovered in the wilds, in the mystery. Be still and know that He is, and that He remembers you, O dreamer. I do not fear sickness, or the grip of death that is continually aside me. When my flesh and blood belongs to something otherworldly that grips me still, when all other noises fall silent and I am still hungry. Bare heights of loneliness, a wilderness whose burning winds sweep over glowing sands. What are they to Him? Even there, He can refresh us. Even there, He can renew us. Look at the sweet way the years have passed, and all the time He is drawing closer. O bright, sad heart, shine quickly from where you hide in the folds of the dark, for where you are is also communion, though you cannot now see it. How many times do I have to tell you that every tear that falls from my tired eyes is a drop of gladness in the cup of my Father. For he has always seen what is beyond, and I am his daughter. That very beautiful and reflective poem, again by Bethany Roberts, and from her book, Reflections, Poems of Communion. So, let's get into our C.S. Lewis for this evening. Again, this is Mere Christianity. On our last episode, we read the preface and the first chapter. In this episode, we will be reading chapters 2 and 3. So if you'll recall, this overall book is subdivided in two ways. First, there are 4 large sections that are referred to as books, and then each book has a number of chapters underneath them. So we are still in the first book, which, if you will recall, is called Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. And we begin now to read Chapter 2, Some Objections. If they are the foundation, I had better stop to make that foundation firm before I go on. Some of the letters I have had show that a good many people find it difficult to understand just what this law of human nature, or moral law, or rule of decent behavior is. For example, some people wrote to me saying, "Isn't what you call the moral law simply our herd instinct? And hasn't it been developed just like all our other instincts?" Now, I do not deny that we may have a herd instinct, but that is not what I mean by the moral law. We all know what it feels like to be prompted by instinct, by a mother's love or sexual instinct, or the instinct for food. It means that you feel a strong want or desire to act in a certain way. And of course, we sometimes do feel just that sort of desire to help another person, and no doubt that desire is due to the herd instinct. But feeling a desire to help is quite different from feeling that you ought to help whether you want to or not. Supposing you hear a cry for help from a man in danger, you will probably feel 2 desires. 1, a desire to give help due to your herd instinct. The other, a desire to keep out of danger due to the instinct for self-preservation. But you will find inside you, in addition to these 2 impulses, a third thing, which tells you that you ought to follow the impulses to help and suppress the impulse to run away. Now, this thing that judges between 2 instincts, that decides which should be encouraged, cannot itself be either of them. You might as well say that the sheet of music which tells you at a given moment to play one note on the piano and not another is itself one of the notes on the keyboard. The moral law tells us the tune we have to play. Our instincts are merely the keys. Another way of seeing that the moral law is not simply one of our instincts is this. If 2 instincts are in conflict, and there is nothing in a creature's mind except those 2 instincts, obviously the stronger of the 2 must win. But at those moments when we are most conscious of the moral law, it usually seems to be telling us to side with the weaker of the 2 impulses. You probably want to be safe much more than you want to help the man who is drowning. But the moral law tells you to help him all the same. And surely it often tells us to try to make the right impulse stronger than it naturally is. I mean, we often feel it our duty to stimulate the herd instinct by waking up our imaginations and arousing our pity and so on, so as to get up enough steam for doing the right thing. But clearly we are not acting from instinct when we set about making an instinct stronger than it is. The thing that says to you your herd instinct is asleep, wake it up, cannot itself be the herd instinct. The thing that tells you which note on the piano needs to be played louder cannot itself be that note. Here's a third way of seeing it. If the moral law was one of our instincts, we ought to be able to point to some one impulse inside us which was always what we call good, always in agreement with the rule of right behavior. But you cannot. There is none of our impulses which the moral law may not sometimes tell us to suppress, and none which it may not sometimes tell us to encourage. It is a mistake to think that some of our impulses, say mother love or patriotism, are good, and others, like sex or the fighting instinct, are bad. All we mean is that the occasions on which the fighting instinct or the sexual desire need to be restrained are rather more frequent than those for restraining mother love or patriotism. But there are situations in which it is the duty of a married man to encourage his sexual impulse, and of a soldier to encourage the fighting instinct. There are also occasions on which a mother's love for her own children or a man's love for his own country have to be suppressed, or they will lead to unfairness towards other people's children or countries. Strictly speaking, there are no such things as good and bad impulses. Think once again of a piano. It has not got two kinds of notes on it, the right notes and the wrong ones. Every single note is right at one time and wrong at another. The moral law is not any one instinct or set of instincts. It is something which makes a kind of tune, the tune we call goodness or right conduct, by directing the instincts. By the way, the point is of great practical consequence. The most dangerous thing you can do is to take any one impulse of your own nature and set it up as the thing you ought to follow at all costs. There is not one of them which will not make us into devils if we set it up as an absolute guide. You might think love of humanity in general was safe, but it is not. If you leave out justice, you will find yourself breaking agreements and faking evidence and trials for the sake of humanity, and become in the end a cruel and treacherous man. Other people wrote to me saying, "Isn't what you call the moral law just a social convention? Something that is put into us by education?" I think there is a misunderstanding here. The people who ask that question are usually taking it for granted that if we have learned a thing from parents and teachers, then that thing must be merely a human invention. But of course that is not so. We all learned the multiplication table at school. A child who grew up alone on a desert island would not know it. But surely it does not follow that the multiplication table is simply a human convention, something human beings have made up for themselves and might have made different if they had liked to. I fully agree that we learn the rule of decent behavior from parents and teachers, and friends and books, as we learn everything else. But some of the things we learn are mere conventions which might have been different. We learn to keep to the left of the road, but it might just as well have been the rule to keep to the right. And others of them, like mathematics, are real truths. The question is, to which class does the law of human nature belong? There are two reasons for saying it belongs to the same class as mathematics. The first is, as I said in the first chapter, that though there are differences between the moral ideas of one time or country and those of another, the differences are not really very great, not nearly so great as most people imagine. And you can recognize the same law running through them all, whereas mere conventions, like the rule of the road or the kind of clothes people wear, may differ to any extent. The other reason is this: when you think about these differences between the morality of one people and another, do you think that the morality of one people is ever better or worse than that of another? Have any of the changes been improvements? If not, then of course there could never be any moral progress. Progress means not just changing, but changing for the better. If no set of moral ideas were truer or better than any other, there would be no sense in preferring civilized morality to savage morality, or preferring Christian morality to Nazi morality. In fact, of course, we all do believe that some moralities are better than others. We do believe that some of the people who tried to change the moral ideas of their own age were what we would call reformers or pioneers, people who understood morality better than their neighbors did. Very well then. The moment you say that one set of moral ideas can be better than another, you are in fact measuring them both by a standard, saying that one of them conforms to that standard more nearly than the other. But the standard that measures two things is something different from either. You are in fact comparing them both with some real morality, admitting that there is such a thing as real right, independent of what people think, and that some people's ideas get nearer to real right than others. Or put it this way, if your moral ideas can be truer, and those of Nazis less true, there must be something, some real morality for them to be true about. The reason why your idea of New York can be truer or less true than mine is that New York is a real place, existing quite apart from what either of us thinks. If when each of us said New York each means merely the town I'm imagining in my own head, how could one of us have truer ideas than the other? There would be no question of truth or falsehood at all. In the same way, if the rule of decent behavior meant simply whatever each nation happens to approve, there would be no sense in saying that any one nation had ever been more correct in its approval than any other. No sense in saying that the world could ever grow morally better or morally worse. I conclude then that though the difference between people's ideas of decent behavior often make you suspect that there is no real natural law of behavior at all, yet the things we are bound to think about these differences really prove just the opposite. But one word before I end. I have met people who exaggerate the differences because they have not distinguished between differences of morality and differences of beliefs about facts. For example, one man said to me, 300 years ago in England, people in England were putting witches to death. Was that what you call the rule of human nature or right conduct? But surely the reason we do not execute witches is that we do not believe that there are such things. If we did, if we really thought that there were people going around who had sold themselves to the devil and received supernatural powers from him in return, and were using these powers to kill their neighbors, or drive them mad, or bring bad weather, surely we would all agree that if anyone deserved the death penalty, then these filthy quislings did. There is no difference of moral principle here. The difference is merely a matter of fact. It may be a great advance in knowledge not to believe in witches. There is no moral advance in not executing them when you do not think they are there. You would not call a man humane for ceasing to set mouse traps if he did so because he believed there were no mice in the house. Chapter 3. The Reality of Law. I now go back to what I said at the end of the first chapter, that there were two odd things about the human race. First, that they were haunted by the idea of a sort of behavior they ought to practice that you might call fair play or decency or morality or the law of nature. Second, that they did not, in fact, do so. Now, some of you may wonder why I called this odd. It may seem to you the most natural thing in the world. In particular, you may have thought I was rather hard on the human race. After all, you may say, what I call breaking the law of right and wrong or of nature only means that people are not perfect. And why on earth should I expect them to be? That would be a good answer if what I was trying to do was to fix the exact amount of blame which is due to us for not behaving as we expect others to behave. That is not my job at all. I am not concerned at present with blame. I am trying to find out truth. And from that point of view, the very idea of something being imperfect, of its not being what it ought to be, has certain consequences. If you take a thing like a stone or a tree, it is what it is, and there seems no sense in saying that it ought to have been otherwise. Of course, you may say a stone is the wrong shape if you want to use it for a rockery, or that the tree is a bad tree because it does not give you as much shade as you expected. But all you mean is that the stone or the tree does not happen to be convenient for some purpose of your own. You are not, except as a joke, truly blaming them for that. You really know that given the weather and the soil, the tree could not have been any different. What we, from our point of view, call a bad tree is obeying the laws of its nature just as much as a good one. Now have you noticed what follows? It follows that what we usually call the laws of nature, the way weather works on a tree, for example, may not really be laws in the strictest sense, but only in a manner of speaking. When you say that falling stones always obey the law of gravitation, is not this much the same as saying that the law only means what stones always do? You do not really think that when a stone is let go, it suddenly remembers that it is under orders to fall to the ground. You only mean that in fact it does fall. In other words, you cannot be sure that there is anything over and above the facts themselves, any law about what ought to happen as distinct from what does happen. The laws of nature as applied to stones or trees may only mean what nature in fact does. But if you turn to the law of human nature, the law of decent behavior, it is a different matter. That law certainly does not mean what human beings in fact do. For as I said before, many of them do not obey this law at all, and none of them obey it completely. The law of gravity tells you what stones do if you drop them, but the law of human nature tells you what human beings ought to do and do not. In other words, when you are dealing with humans, something else comes in above and beyond the actual facts. You have the facts, how men do behave. You also have something else, how they ought to behave. In the rest of the universe, there need not be anything but the facts. Electrons and molecules behave in a certain way, and certain results follow, and that may be the whole story. But men behave in a certain way, and that is not the whole story, for all the time you know that they ought to behave differently. Now this is really so peculiar that one is tempted to try to explain it away. For instance, we might try to make out that when you say a man ought not to act as he does, you only mean the same as when you say that a stone is the wrong shape, namely that what he is doing happens to be inconvenient to you. But that is simply untrue. A man occupying the corner seat in the train because he got there first, and a man who slipped into it while my back was turned and removed my bag, are both equally inconvenient. But I blame the second man, and do not blame the first. I'm not angry, except perhaps for a moment before I come to my senses, with a man who trips me up by accident. I am angry with a man who tries to trip me up even if he does not succeed. Yet the first has hurt me and the second has not. Sometimes the behavior which I call bad is not inconvenient to me at all, but the very opposite. In war, each side may find a traitor on the other side very useful. But though they use him and pay him, they regard him as human vermin. So you cannot say that what we call decent behavior in others is simply the behavior that happens to be useful to us. And as for decent behavior in ourselves, I suppose it is pretty obvious that it does not mean the behavior that pays. It means things like being content with 30 shillings when you might have got £3. Doing schoolwork honestly when it would be easy to cheat. Leaving a girl alone when you would like to make love to her. Staying in dangerous places when you would rather go somewhere safer. Keeping promises you would rather not keep, and telling the truth even when it makes you look like a fool. Some people say that though decent conduct does not mean what pays each particular person at a particular moment, still it means what pays the human race as a whole, and that consequently there is no mystery about it. Human beings, after all, have some sense. They see that you cannot have any real safety or happiness except in a society where everyone plays fair, and it is because they see this that they try to behave decently. Now, of course, it is perfectly true that safety and happiness can only come from individuals, classes, and nations being honest and fair and kind to each other. It is one of the most important truths in the world. But as an explanation of why we feel as we do about right and wrong, it just misses the point. If we ask, why ought I to be unselfish, and you reply, because it is good for society, we may then ask, why should I care what's good for society, except when it happens to pay me personally? And then you'll have to say, well, because you ought to be unselfish, which simply brings us back to where we started. You are saying what is true, but you are not getting any further. If a man asked what was the point of playing football, it would not be much good saying in order to score goals. For trying to score goals is the game itself, not the reason for the game. And you would really only be saying that football was football, which is true, but not worth saying. In the same way, if a man asks what is the point of behaving decently, it is no good replying in order to benefit society. For trying to benefit society, in other words, being unselfish, for society, after all, only means other people, is one of the things decent behavior consists in. All you are really saying is that decent behavior is decent behavior. You would have said just as much if you had stopped at the statement, men ought to be unselfish. And that is where I do stop. Men ought to be unselfish, ought to be fair. Not that men are unselfish, not that they like being unselfish, but that they ought to be. The moral law, or the law of human nature, is not simply a fact about human behavior in the same way as the law of gravitation is, or may be simply a fact about how heavy objects behave. On the other hand, it is not a mere fancy, for we cannot get rid of the idea, and most of the things we say and think about men would be reduced to nonsense if we did. And it is not simply a statement about how we should like men to behave for our own convenience. For the behavior we call bad or unfair is not exactly the same as the behavior we find inconvenient, and may even be the opposite. Consequently, this rule of right and wrong, or law of human nature, or whatever you call it, must somehow or other be a real thing. A thing that is really there, not made up by ourselves. And yet it is not a fact in the ordinary sense. In the same way as our actual behavior is a fact, it begins to look as if we shall have to admit that there is more than one kind of reality. That in this particular case there is something above and beyond the ordinary facts of men's behavior, and yet quite definitely real. A real law which none of which none of us made, but which we find pressing on us. That is the end of our 2 chapters for this evening. So I don't know if any of you have any comments. I'll give you a minute. I know it takes a minute for the video to kind of catch up to me. I do have the chat open, so if you have any thoughts about what we've just read, I encourage you to to let us know. Type it into the chat and we'll discuss it. To me, what he's saying seems sensible here. The point of what he's trying to do is establish that there is something outside of us that lets us know what decent behavior is. Now, the reason for this, if you'll remember from last week as we discussed, is that C.S. Lewis, may have been raised Anglican, but was in his adult years as a professor at Oxford, was a decided atheist. He did not believe in God at all. And he came to the conclusion, after having discussions with some of his friends, including the other famous author J.R.R. Tolkien, that he was wrong. He came to the conclusion that God did exist. And so what he's preparing here as we're going through this right now is one of his arguments. He is arguing about the fact that, if there's not, that there is something outside ourselves, and it can't be merely instinct. The fact is, for example, if we talk about evolutionary instinct, it is generally accepted in evolutionary science that there is a push from creatures to propagate their own and benefit their own. Well, under that very idea, then racism makes some kind of logical sense. And yet all of us agree that racism is wrong. Now again, evolutionarily speaking, it would make sense. It would make sense to believe that our, own kind, we wouldn't necessarily see it as one human race. Those people are different in one way or another. And so you would seek to benefit your particular group over any other group. But we accept that this is wrong. And you can tell this by the fact that racism is not a human instinct. Children learn racism. If you leave, children together playing who have different races, they don't generally end up being racist in and of themselves. It's when they get pulled away, we don't play with those type of people, or we don't associate with those type of people, we don't marry those type of people. That is when the racism becomes passed on. And we accept that that is not decent behavior, that that is wrong. And so we line ourselves up against something that is not a base instinct. He makes some excellent points. If there is no measuring stick, no kind of law of human nature, if you will, then who is to say whether any particular form of morality is better than another form? And generally we accept that the Nazis did things that were wrong and indecent and against proper behavior. That is the general acceptance of the world for the most part. But who is to say that that is the case? What are we measuring their behavior against? He mentions the thing where people refer to seeming immoralities of the past, things like burning witches. And he's kind of right. The reason we don't burn witches is because we don't believe in witches. If there was someone going around murdering their neighbors, whether it, with witchcraft, we would probably still be, I'm not sure whether we would be burning them, but we would at least be punishing them in some way. And we generally, it's because we don't believe in them. That's the reason. It's not because we've become more moral. It is simply that the facts that we are judging things by have changed. We have learned and accepted that the facts believed at the time, that there were witches running around doing these things, is a bit ridiculous. The guy's cattle died probably because, it got a sickness or something. It not because his neighbor is a witch who cursed him. But, so that's kind of, I'm not seeing any comments here tonight, so we're probably going to wrap up a bit here. So our next episode will be on Wednesday, which I believe is the 22nd, but I'll check in a moment. And let's see, we will be reading chapter 4 and chapter 5, which will bring us to the end of book 1. So we'll be reading both of those on Wednesday. I hope to see some of you there. Hopefully we can get a conversation going. I know perhaps not as many people are watching right now because I forgot to kind of post an hour or so ahead of time that the episode was coming up. I kind of posted it about 5 minutes before we went live, so people may not have had time to realize that we were going up. So again, this has been Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, and we will continue to be reading this until we finish with this book. I hope to see you all on Wednesday, and I hope all of you have a fantastic evening. Thank you.